Welcome, everybody. Glad you could attend. We're going to give it a few more seconds for folks to join. They're coming in now to the webinar. But if you want, you could throw into the chat where you're dialing in from and maybe how hot it is. I know up here in Michigan, we are suffering under a heat dome. So it's over 100 degrees with the feels like temperature outside. So hope you're cool wherever you are. But we'll get going in just in a few.
Yeah, Nebraska can't decide what it's at. So we had 2 days last week that were over 100, and then we had 2 days that didn't even break 70. So
Oh
we are just
boy,
up and down and up and down, and yeah, can't decide at all what it's going to do.
the weather roller coaster.
Yes.
Terrific. So a few more joining. And for those who have not attended before, I'll just mention that I'm Jeff Drabont with Lad Custom Publishing. Our Lad Digital services and products, we do have AI embedded within those with the Creator Studio and the Student Center. And that's the reason why we're delivering this AI webinar series is to help understand better the role of AI on campus and some of the possibilities that it holds. So yeah, just promoting the understanding of AI on campus. So we'll get started. So thanks again for joining us. And I just want to welcome our presenter, Gene Mandernack, who is joining us from up and down weather-wise Nebraska. And so Jean leads technology and education initiatives with Grand Canyon University. And we're really pleased that she's able to join us today. Our fifth out of six webinars that we're delivering on AI and higher ed. So the next one coming up is on August 5th. Please join us. And that's kind of stepping way back, big picture, where we'll be talking about the role of adoption of AI from a sort of campus-wide perspective. So that's on August 5th, and I'll throw the link in the chat in a moment. So if you want to register for that. So without any further ado, I'll hand things over to Jean and say, thanks again for joining us, everybody, and Jean as well. So over to you, Jean.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining. I know this time of the year is really, really challenging. Not only are we in the midst of summer stuff, but it's almost 4th of July. So a lot of people are out on break. So if you're joining us live, thank you. And if you're watching the recording later, I hope you had a great 4th of July holiday. Whenever we talk about AI, there are two primary questions that come up. The first one is, what do we do about students using AI? How do we deal with assessments? How do we deal with assignments? And that's a question that we've actually addressed in some of the previous webinars. So if that's something that you're still kind of struggling with and looking at, I would encourage you to go to the link that Jeff is going to share, and you can take a look at that one. The second question is the one that we're going to deal with today. And that's when faculty say, AI can do everything. AI can produce content, AI can tutor them, AI can grade their assignments, AI can give feedback. If AI can do all of that, why am I even here? And I've had a lot of faculty even tell me, I don't think faculty are going to exist. I don't think teachers are going to exist. What should we be doing to hold our jobs in this AI era? And I actually think that that's really kind of the wrong question, because all of this implies that AI can somehow replace what we do simply because it's here. The only part of that that's true is that AI is here. When we look at the statistics, it is undeniable. Students are using AI. Over 90% will tell us they're using AI. And if we have 92% that are saying they're using AI, I'm going to guess it's actually higher when we consider the students that are afraid to admit that they're using AI for fear they're going to be accused of cheating. And even within that, almost 90% of them are like, yeah, and I'm using it for assignments. And yet, most of them are using it. They're using it for assignments. And they're telling us, I'm not really getting a lot of information. I'm not getting a lot of support. I'm not getting a lot of training. I'm not getting a lot of how-to information. And then when we talk to the faculty, that makes sense. Because on the other hand, we have faculty saying, oh my gosh, students are over relying on AI. They are absolutely terrified that as students continue to use AI more and more, that they're not going to think. The early research that came out on this actually backed this up. And they said as students were doing cognitive offloading to AI, they were retaining less, they were thinking less, they simply were not processing the information. And so when we ask faculty, Are you concerned about students' AI use? Overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. And if students are using it, we're also concerned about what does this mean for us? What does this mean for how I need to teach and what I need to do? And it doesn't really matter which survey we look at it. Faculty have said, yes, my students are using AI. No, I don't know what to do about it. And not only do I not know what to do about it from a student perspective, but from a faculty perspective, I also don't know how to use AI. And so a lot of them are getting really worked up into this, like, what do I do? Because I don't know how AI applies to my role. I don't know how it applies in my classroom. I don't know enough about AI to know how to use it effectively. And then that leads us back to that big question. So if students are going to use it, and I don't know what this means for my job, do I even have a job? What is left for me? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because I believe overwhelmingly and with no hesitation that the faculty role is not going to shrink because of AI. In fact, I think it's becoming more important than ever. If we think back historically, and I'm talking historically hundreds of years, we did see faculty as content providers. That's where the lecture emerged from. It was all the way back when students didn't have easy access to textbooks. They didn't have easy access to information. And so the faculty's job was to stand in front of them, provide lectures, and give the students content. And as the faculty gave that content, students would write it down and they would take their notes. And then, so that we could ensure that they understood us correctly and that they had a good understanding of that content, we would give them assignments. We would give tests, quizzes, papers, whatever it might be, and we would then grade it to tell them, did you understand the content that I gave you? Well, if we want to believe that that's still our job as faculty, we're right. That job is easily replaced by AI. In fact, that job was easily replaced by the internet because the internet can give them the content. The internet they can put in their information and the internet can tell them if they're right or if they're wrong, if our entire job is about content delivery. But I would argue in the era of AI, students are overwhelmed with content. At the touch of a button, they can pull up ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, Claude, you name it, hundreds of other AI engines, and they can ask anything they want. They can put in their ideas and get feedback on those ideas. In a world where students are overwhelmed with content, the question is not, am I still relevant? The question is, how is my role shifting? And how do I need to guide students through and create value in this educational experience when I'm aware of the fact that they don't need me for content and they really don't even need us for feedback? What they need us is to guide the learning experience. Even AI can only give you content if you ask it the question, if you prompt it correctly. It can only give feedback if you tell it how you need that feedback and what kind of feedback you're needing. Students not only don't have the AI literacy to do that well, but they don't have the content knowledge to do that well. So while we aren't needed anymore to give them content, we are absolutely needed to create learning experiences and to think about, how do I create a learning experience that can truly guide my students to engage with that content that is so readily available? How do I get them to think about, when is that content relevant? When is that content not relevant? What questions do I need to be asking? In what ways do I need to be critical of that information that I can receive? How do I need to think about shades of gray when I know that algorithms are set up to lean towards one side or another? Students don't know enough about our disciplines to engage with that content that they're being given. And that's where we come in. They don't need us to deliver the knowledge. They need us to teach them how to think. And that is the evolving role of a faculty member that is going to become more and more important as AI allows them to get information at the touch of a button. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. What does it mean to create a really meaningful learning experience? Because most of us grew up in an area of education in which it was about content delivery and content regurgitation. We received lectures, we took notes, we took a test to show that we understood those notes, and now we tend to teach the way that we were taught. And AI is blowing up that equation. And so you want to start thinking about, what does it mean to learn for a student today? And then how do I guide that experience? So it's really about making those teaching behaviors and that teaching and learning dynamic a lot more visible. Because right now, when a student has a challenge or they have a question or we ask them to read something, it's really, really easy for them to go to AI and say, summarize this for me, teach me about this, tell me about this. And some faculty have tried to deal with this by banning AI. And I actually argue that that's the wrong approach. What we really need to do is think about, when I'm aware of the fact that before class, students are using their AI to prepare, how do I embrace that and make sure that they're coming into my class prepared so that in class, I can quit delivering content because they don't need me to deliver content. And so now you start reshaping those classroom experiences about getting students to think. If we go back to some of the statistics I shared with you at the beginning of the presentation, faculty have said, my students aren't critically thinking. They are just passively giving information to AI and they're no longer thinking. Well, that's our responsibility. We now need to start to shift this and say, what would it look like if my student was thinking? And how do I create a classroom environment, whether that's online or face-to-face, in which I can get students to engage and to think and to dive deeply? And how do I utilize AI to make sure they're coming into class with the prerequisite knowledge and content so that they can take advantage of those activities? And then after students leave, how do I use AI to make sure that we are having them pull it together, to engage with the AI in a meaningful way and not simply offload that? Teaching is not about just what we do in class. It's about that entire continuum of how do we engage students with our content in ways that actually not only make them think, but motivate them to think, engage them with the material, and create an environment in which they're willing to go beyond just content knowledge. Because if we think about the things that we provide as humans that AI cannot replace, that's what we want to lean into. We can provide judgment, we can provide relationship, we can provide social support, we can provide modeling. We can teach them how to think within our discipline. And when we start to shift that I'm not trying to cover chapter 3, I'm trying to get them to think critically. And it just happens that today the topic is this content knowledge from chapter 3. It starts to change that teaching and learning experience. Because AI does not have judgment. As much as it might look like it on the surface, as much as students lean into it and trust what it says, AI doesn't know the nuances of when it can be pushed back. It doesn't know when to say, yeah, but isn't that this perspective? Or where was that sourced from? Or I know that's the common knowledge, but what about this emerging research that doesn't show up as prevalently in that training data? And that judgment is what we want to start role modeling for our students. We want to teach them not to dismiss AI or to avoid AI, but to use it with judgment so that they have some ideas about, how do I know what questions to ask and when I should push back? What does it mean when one AI tool gives me an answer that's different from another AI tool? How do I critically compare those answers? And how do I understand why they were different in the first place? And so what we really want to think about is, how do we start to guide students with this judgment, getting them to think about, what is evidence? What am I looking for in that content? How do I know if it's true? And what does it mean when things are not clear cut? Talking about things like ethics, in which AI can absolutely spit out for us ethical principles, but it starts to flounder when it's not clear cut how it's applied in contextual situations. That's what our students need us from. They need us to think about, what do we do when there's not content knowledge? And then within that, we live in a world that is unbelievably fast-paced. And the reason that we all jump on AI and love AI is because it's efficient. It gives us fast answers. It produces fast content. It can absolutely speed things up. But in that, we often lose the source of what makes learning truly learning. That relationship where when students are struggling and when they don't have time, that there's someone they can reach out to. When there's someone that can see that look of confusion and say, I don't think you really understand what we're doing here. Let's dive in a little deeper. Or talk to me about what you're struggling with. They still need somebody to say, we're going to have class on Thursday, and so you need to do it by that time. You need to be accountable to this content. So even though AI can give them the content, it can't create the environment that keeps them there. One of the things that we hear a lot about in higher education these days is retention. We know that retention is a struggle for a lot of universities right now, and that they're doing a lot of things of how do we keep students engaged in the classroom. And the research is really clear. It's not about the content we teach them. It's about the relationships. And when students start to struggle and when they get overwhelmed and when things start moving too quickly, the one thing that can keep them there is the relationship with the faculty. That there's someone that can ask questions, when there's somebody that reaches out, when there's somebody that cares. And AI cannot replace that. And then just seeing how people think in the discipline. As I mentioned earlier, while students can get that content knowledge from AI, they often don't know what to question. They simply lack the skills within our discipline to know when to push back, to say that doesn't sound right, or is that accurate, or can you give me a source for that? They just don't have enough disciplinary knowledge to know. And that's where we start to role model that for them. We can actually say, here's the kinds of questions I would ask. Here's what I do when I engage with AI on a collaborative project. And so not only are we teaching them some of that AI literacy, but we're teaching it uniquely within our discipline on how do I use it in this particular context. When is it okay to use it and when is it not? Just recently in one of my statistics classes, my students said, why do we even need to know statistics anymore when AI can just spit it out? And I said, well, that's a great question. Let's dive into that question. And so we took a data set and we put it into SPSS and we ran the data set. And then we put it into AI and we asked AI to complete the same analysis. And it gave different answers. And I asked the students, why are they different? And they all were like, well, I don't know. And I said, well, let's dig into this. What does it mean that they're different? And we started to dig in. And what we realized as we were digging into it is that AI by default went to population parameters, and the other SPSS went to sample parameters. But as we started talking about it, then students were like, oh, well, how would we know? And I said, that's that uncertainty that requires the disciplinary knowledge to dig deeper, to ask the questions, to know when to push back, to know when we want to practice, when we need to tell it more information, and when we need to guide it. And so students, it's not that we need them to not use AI. We actually need them to see us using AI and using it within the discipline in ways that model what that's going to look like for them. So with that said, I'm going to talk about 7 specific things you can start doing with your students to bring back some of that judgment and that human connection and that modeling of how to engage with AI. The first one, and this one I think is the easiest one, make your thinking visible. It's not about communicating the content for them. It's about communicating in your brain how you engage with the information. So, as an example of this, I teach psychology. And the other day we were in my human development class and we were doing a scenario. And in the scenario, there was no clear-cut answer of how that parent should deal with that child. It was about adolescent parent-child relationships. And so we pulled up the scenario and I actually told the students, I'm like, go ahead. And I had one group put it into Claude. I had one group put it into Gemini. I had one group put it into Copilot. And I had another group put it into ChatGPT. So we had 4 different groups. And I said, I want you to put it in there and I want you to ask the AI to analyze the situation from a developmental psychology perspective. And I want you to see what it gives you. And so step 1, the students all put it in and we started by just comparing what they found. What did it tell you? What did it bring up as key points to focus on? And what we found is while there were slight differences, generally speaking, the AI pointed them in the same direction regardless of which tool we happened to use. And then I asked the students, okay, as you look at these outputs, what's the first thing that you think about? And at that point, most of my students just gave me a blank stare because they weren't thinking. AI had answered it for them, and they just accepted that answer without thinking any more deeply. And so, after I gave it a pause that was long enough to be awkward and uncomfortable, I then said, let me tell you what I think as I read this output. And I started with the first thing I notice is that it gave us answers that are very stereotypical American individualistic culture. When we ask it just openly to analyze this relationship, it made some assumptions. And it made assumptions that I can see based on the fact that it did not think about collectivist cultures. It did not think about non traditional families. It did not think about multi generational families. And so I started to point that out, and students started going, oh, oh. And then I said, the second thing I notice is that in multiple places in the AI output, it said, research says. What research? Ask it what research. Ask it to find you the citation and then verify that citation. So we spent that entire class period that happened to be the topic we were focusing on was parent-child relationships when the children are in adolescence. So the entire conversation was about that topic, but it was about deeper thinking than just what the AI gave us. And so from that activity, we then went into, okay, let's go find the study. What did that study say? Did all of them say that? When we ask it for research, which other things did it pull up? Which of those studies are more recent? Which are more generalizable? What was the sample size in the study? I had the disciplinary knowledge to ask the right questions. What I needed to do was make my thinking visible for them. So I just narrated out loud exactly the way I would as an expert in the discipline when AI gives me information. And in many cases, AI gave very, accurate but superficial answers. And I would tell the students, is that sufficient? As I read that, I think to myself, yes, but that's true, but is there a nuance to that? And then the students often said, yeah, but like I don't know enough. I didn't know there was a nuance. And I said, well, then maybe that's one of your tips now when you're dealing with AI is to say, are there any nuances that go deeper than this that I might not be aware of? But that's the thinking I made visible. What are the nuances? What is the research? What are the assumptions that AI gave? What did that algorithm produce that students maybe didn't think about because they were just taking it for granted? And so you want to do activities in which you absolutely start showing students how you, as an expert, would critique that. I love to do this one with case studies just because it usually gives us a nice wide open place that we can start with that disciplinary content. And it also opens the door that I can ask students for some of their critical thinking first. I will tell you, there's usually not much. But then as I start to point out my thinking process, then the students will get going and they'll be like, oh, yeah, what about this? Or what about this? As another example, this is one that we did in my social psychology class. I told the students, I go, I want you to go to AI and upload a picture of yourself. And then just tell AI, give me a family and show me what my family might look like. And so all the students did it. They thought it was hilarious. They came back and I said, what did you notice when AI gave you your family? And at first, they just noticed kind of the obvious things like, oh, it gave us all two children. And in most cases, it was a boy and a girl. And then I said, well, let's start digging deeper. Were there any heterosexual couples? Were there any homosexual couples? Was there anybody that was handicapped? Were there any mixed race couples? What assumptions are in the AI algorithms that when we gave it a very vague question, that's what we got? And then that led us into our discussion on stereotypes and prejudice and all of these, inherent biases that we make or implicit biases that we make when we don't think deeply. So we used AI as a launching point, making my thinking visible about what AI was producing in those assumptions, and then tying it back to the disciplinary content of the class. Another one, and this one, I kind of put these as separate teaching behaviors, but the reality is they all are kind of intermixed and they cross each other a little bit. But spend less time telling and spend more time asking questions. Again, they can get the content at a touch of a button. So you're going to want to start by ensuring that you have activities and assignments that force them to engage with the content. Let them use AI. Have activities that require them to use AI, but have them engaging with the content so that when you get to interact with them, you're not giving them content anymore. You're now going to talk to them. And here it says ask better questions, but I almost should really rephrase this as engage in dialogue because it shouldn't sound like you're giving them an oral quiz where you're wanting to know, well, what is the answer to that? Do you understand this theory? Can you name this principle? You really want them to start thinking about how they make decisions. Like, how did you come to that choice? What theories would explain the different options that we have here? What evidence would you need to change your mind? If we're analyzing, this case or something, what other information is missing? How might somebody from a different culture analyze this case? How might it be analyzed differently if we were in a different era or in a different time, or if we did this 20 years ago? You want students to not be able to just regenerate content for you. You want to create an environment where they have to think about that content, process that content, and do something with it. So you want them to reflect, you want them to apply, you want them to analyze, and this is best done through dialogue where it doesn't feel like they're being put on the spot. For me, this is where I love the online discussion boards because often in a face-to-face class, it's too much pressure for a student to on the spot be like, well, what assumptions are you making? And they're like, I don't know what assumptions I'm making. But in an online discussion board, you can say, what assumptions are you making? Think about it a little bit. And students have some time to actually like process that and think about what assumptions they may have made. Or asking them, what evidence would you need to sway you? Because those are questions that there really usually isn't a right off the cuff answer that I can just spit back to you. But they're also the same kind of questions that really get students to start to dive in and think about our disciplinary content and think about the nuances of what that means and how we would apply that. Related to that, then, is talk to them. There's a reason that they called it the Socratic method. Long, long ago, before we ever had textbooks, before we ever even had formalized education with a faculty member lecturing, those philosophers would literally sit and talk to their students. Hence the Socratic method. We're just going to ask them questions and we're going to use those questions to dig deeper. And so rather than approaching it as a lecture situation, use it as a dialogue situation in which you say, you know what? Here we're going to sit down and we're going to analyze this, but we're really going to start thinking about what that means. What other evidence that doesn't exist? What else would you need to know? I actually like to bring AI into this one because often, depending on the level of students that you're working with, they don't necessarily have that content knowledge. So it might even be that I'll say, today we're talking about helping behavior. That's another topic we just did last week in my social psychology class. And overwhelmingly, students tell me if I saw somebody in need, I would help. And I say, oh, but would you? And then we talk about some of the classic cases of helping behavior in social psychology and the whole bystander effect and the fact that most of us really don't help. But it's not because we aren't helpful people. It's because the social context makes it ambiguous. And we're often not sure if they need help. We don't want to get in the way. We don't want to cause problems. We don't know that we have the knowledge. We look to other people. If other people aren't helping, we don't help because we use other people as a guide. And we talk about all of these things. And students still say, but I think I would help. And I say, well, let's dig deeper into this. Let's start really getting into, go to AI and ask it. I think I would help. Provide counter arguments on why I might not. And I have them then fight with AI and argue with AI. Let's actually engage. And then we come back as a group and I say, okay, I want to disagree together. Who still believes that they would help? And of course, after they've fought with AI, it usually goes down a little bit. And they're like, okay, you're right. I probably wouldn't under some circumstances and other circumstances I would. And then I create an environment where they can now discuss it with each other. So why did you say yes and you said no? What were the differences in the assumptions you made? What were the differences in the context you're thinking about? How are your backgrounds different that might have shaped that or changed that? So you really want to start to get them to think about situations and when there's not a correct answer. And so they're going to practice that thinking and that dialogue and that exchange and that back and forth. And within that, then, just giving time to let them actually think. One of our greatest challenges in our society right now is we struggle with silence and we struggle when we feel like we're not using our time effectively. So in teaching, we often spend a lot of time really peppering them and wanting a quick answer. When sometimes the most effective part is to say, I'm going to ask a question and I'm going to actually set a timer. And for the next 2 or 3 minutes, however long, I don't want anyone to answer. I want you to think. And based on my students' responses, what they typically tell me is when I do that, for the first like 30 seconds or so, they just blankly stare and they aren't really thinking and they aren't really processing. But when you give it enough time to let that immediate blank stare wear off, then the discomfort of the silence actually starts to push them to think. So ask the questions, intentional follow up questions, and then give enough time for it to get uncomfortable. Because it's in that discomfort that they often will start to process the information when they realize you're not just going to ask the question and roll on without their thinking. And then coach them through with that feedback. As we're asking them to engage with the content, quit just telling them right or wrong, but start saying, like, I'm confused as to why you made this assumption. Talk to me about it. Or you made kind of a claim here that doesn't seem backed by the following research studies. I don't want to tell you you're wrong, but what I do want you to do is defend your initial claim. Provide some justification. Tell them, here's some assumptions I'm seeing in your argument that you didn't make clear. Which one of these seems to be true for you in this context? There's a lot of emerging research right now on AI that has said, if we look at that first initial body of research that came out, in which they said AI is killing thinking, students are just cognitively offloading, they're just giving it to AI and they're not thinking at all, the research was absolutely true. But what they actually have found as they've evolved is a lot of it was a product of how we were asking students to do assignments. We were giving them assignments, not really giving them guidance on how to use AI, not telling them they couldn't, but not telling them what to do. So what was happening was they really were spending so much of their mental energy just putting it into AI and doing it that they really weren't thinking any more deeply. But the newest research is saying if we give students a task and fully embrace and tell them, use the AI, completely offload these components of the task to AI, what it actually does is it frees up some of that mental energy so now they can think again. And they've actually gotten emerging studies that have just been coming out here in 2026. It's been coming out in the spring that have found when students intentionally offload some of the tasks that they're doing, so like use AI to write it up or use AI to summarize it, it frees up mental energy for them to think more deeply, even more deeply than prior to using AI at all. And in those cases, then, what the faculty are saying is now when I come in with the feedback, students have some of that mental energy to truly think about the feedback. So we can think about, did my thought process change? Not just did my writing get better? And so you really want to look at where you're putting the feedback. Because if we put the feedback on the thinking process, students are more likely to engage with that thinking process. And so you want to be sure as you're building that learning environment, you're putting students' time and effort on the things you care about. And so if you care about the thinking, the feedback needs to be on the thinking as opposed to on the writing and that product they produce. Which leads us to actually bring AI in. If intentionally offloading some of that work to AI frees up cognitive energy for students to think more deeply, let's bring it in, let's offload some of that, and then let's provide specific guidance for students on how to use that AI effectively. If you've been to one of my other sessions, you've heard one of the trends that I've done over the last several years is shifting where I used to have students write literature reviews. I no longer have them do that, and I now have them critique and annotate AI literature reviews. And it really kind of goes back to that research I just mentioned, because when a student has to write a literature review, there's a lot of things that are going on cognitively. One, they have to have been able to find all the necessary journal articles. They have to have read the journal articles. They have to have understood the journal articles. I care about those things. Then they had to be able to bring them together and synthesize them. And they had to be able to write. They had to communicate well. They had to have flow. They had to have APA style. They had to have APA in text citations. They had to be able to write their APA list and the proper reference list, all of these things. Well, when I think about that assignment, what I really cared about was they understood the research with a critical perspective so that when they were bringing it together and synthesizing it, they would know which studies to like place weight on, which ones to kind of ignore. But what I cared about with the assignment was the critical thinking. What students overwhelmingly told me was they're so bogged down in the writing and the APA style that they weren't thinking critically at all. And what ended up happening was they would go to AI, they would ask AI for some journal articles. They wouldn't even know enough about AI literacy to know if those were real or not real. They would ask it to summarize those articles. And then because they were afraid of being caught using AI on their writing, they would put all their time and effort into the writing part of it to avoid getting cheating. And then I would give feedback on the thinking that never occurred because they didn't think. They were so focused on the writing that they couldn't put the effort where it mattered. So I changed that assignment completely. And I said, what I care about is for you to be able to be a critical consumer of the research and for you to see gaps. And so step one of that assignment now is go to the library first, and I want you to get the journal articles you think you are interested in. Then just upload them to AI and have AI summarize them. And then ask AI to point out the strengths and weaknesses. Ask AI to point out for you where you should pay attention and where you shouldn't. I'm letting them intentionally, cognitively offload that task. And then tell AI what you think. So now you're going to go into AI and you're going to say, it seems like these two studies are stronger. It seems like this one isn't as strong. It feels like there's a gap. Here was a couple unanswered questions. Here's something I'm not sure if I understand correctly. And I want you to talk with AI about that critical analysis of these articles. And then tell AI, write me a literature review based on everything we just talked about. AI, offload it completely. Write me a literature review. And then I ask the students now, critique the literature review that AI wrote. Go back. And first of all, I want you to start with that reference list. Did it go beyond the articles you gave it? And if so, were they even real? And then I talked to the students about the fact that AI doesn't work like that library search engine they just did. The library search engine goes and finds articles based on keywords and brings them back. That's not how AI works. AI is a prediction machine. So when we ask it questions, it predicts what it's supposed to think. So it goes and finds articles related to that and then pulls them together and makes predictions. But it didn't find a specific source. So I want you to identify those hallucinations. Was there anything that it brought up that wasn't real? Now, just because the reference wasn't real may or may not mean that information wasn't real. So go back. Whatever it cited, is that real? Is it accurate? If it's accurate, how do we now find the right source for that? So I talked to the students about how do we use AI to really get at the thinking. And in the end of that assignment, I have them to submit two things. One, they submit that initial chat log where they were asking AI questions about the articles and they were pointing out their thoughts and they were pointing out the gaps. And then the second thing I have them submit is their annotation. Where did it oversimplify? Where was there maybe bias? Where were there hallucinations? Where were there things that it couldn't back up the claim? Where did it make assumptions and say things like research says without telling us what the research was? That's what I always cared about when I asked students to write literature reviews. But that wasn't what they were focused on. They were focused on the writing, and the writing was the least important thing for me in that particular task. So think about for your tasks, what is it that you care about? And how can I bring AI in to actually streamline students' focus and attention to the things that I truly care about? And that task actually had students thinking much more deeply about the research than they ever had when they were writing literature reviews. When they were writing literature reviews, what they told me is they spent a lot of time on the process of writing. They didn't spend a lot of time thinking. And so if we want students to think, we can bring AI in and integrate it in ways that actually points them towards the thinking. And then talk to them about where that works and where that doesn't within your discipline. I was just talking to a faculty member the other day and they teach writing in the discipline. And they said that defeats the purpose of my class, having students offload the writing. And I said, well, then Don't do that in your class. In your class, you need to talk to the students about why the process of writing is essential and what that's building for them that they're going to need in their professional careers. Because even though our students are ruthlessly efficient, they also want to be prepared for the careers that they're going into. And so when they see tasks as hoops with no real value, there's a good chance they're going to use AI and they're going to bypass the entire process just to get the grade. But when we start to teach them the value of the tasks within our profession, then they're much more likely to engage. So it's not just I'm using AI and it's okay, or I'm not and it's not okay. It's when in our profession is this okay and when is it not? And when do I need to cite that? When do I need to provide attribution for that? What is relevant? And this is a question I can't answer for any of you because I tell my students I have to answer this differently for any individual class that I'm in. When is AI going to actually help in this context? And when is it not? And when not only is it not, but when is it actually undermining either what I'm doing professionally or what's happening or the credibility or the ethics? Because I teach in psychology, we have a lot of stuff related to clinical counseling, abnormal psychology, and we talk to them about, is it even ethical to offload some of that? What does it mean to share that information? Are we violating privacy or confidentiality in those things? So it's not just about learning to use AI, but learning when it's appropriate, when it's not, and what those boundaries look like specifically within your discipline. Because students not only don't have good general AI literacy, they really don't have any concept of disciplinary AI literacy. And they're looking to us for that. So you want to think about for whatever discipline you teach, where does AI help? When is it risky? And what do you need them to remain uniquely human with? And then the last one, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, the world is moving so quickly and they're so used to trying to do things efficiently. Sometimes you just want to slow them down and give it time to think. So when AI can spit it out in seconds, you say, okay, now let's slow down and think about this. Let's do a 5-minute reflection at the end of class. Just the other day in one of my live classes, I actually said, we ended 7 minutes early, and I said, okay, here's how the last 7 minutes are going to go. For the next 3 minutes, want you to think about that day we happen to be talking about professional ethics, research ethics. And I said, I want you to think about how AI could influence professional ethics. And I'm going to, for 3 minutes, I'm going to say nothing, do nothing. And I want you to literally close your eyes, sit and think. And we just stopped. And then that left us 4 minutes. And so then after their 3 minutes, I said, I want to give you some questions to think more deeply. And so then I did some of that. Here's what I was thinking about. So I modeled for them my thinking. And that took about a minute, minute and a half. And I said, now I want you to, for the last 2 minutes that we have available, jot down. I'm not worried about writing. I'm not worried about sentences. I'm not worried about transition. I'm not worried about spelling. I don't care. Bullet list, jot down. What are your greatest concerns? How has your thinking changed? Did it at all? I just want you to think about your own thinking. I want you to think about that process. And so it's not just asking the questions, but it's giving the time to think about them. Because it doesn't really matter whether we're teaching face to face, whether we're teaching online, whether you're hybrid. In any given environment, our students are needing space to think. They're needing us to model how to think, and they're needing us to create assignments and activities that push them to think rather than generate information or spit back to us that content knowledge. So if you're live, there's a lot of these out loud dialogue, problem solving kind of things you can do. But if you're in the online environment, you can move those into a reflective discussion board. I often have even started to do some email ones with my students where I'll say, I don't need this to be public, but I do want you to think about it and respond to me. Just shoot me an email once you've had a chance to really process it. And then with that feedback, when I give them the feedback, I do the feedback on their thinking, the content of it. And I'll ask another question. So the feedback isn't me correcting, telling they're right, telling them wrong, but actually the feedback is engaging continued discussion and dialogue in that. I want them to think about what they're thinking. And you don't have to do all of these. Start small. Hopefully, my goal for you after attending today is that there was one thing that as I was talking, you were like, ooh, that would work in my class. Pick the one thing and try it. And then see, did it change? Did you get students thinking more? Maybe it's just changing how you do your feedback. Maybe it's changing how you do your discussions. Maybe it's changing how you prep students for class so that you can free up some of that time. Change one thing, and then I want you to think about your thinking. And I want you to think, did that help me achieve my goals? Because if you give better feedback and you're like, nope, my students are still not thinking at all, well, then that didn't get you towards your goal. So the feedback didn't help you in that context. You're going to need to try something else. But you have to be intentional, knowing what you hope to accomplish so that you can think about how did that shift that student experience. The goal here is not just to offload everything to AI. It's to really let AI do what AI does well. And it does a lot of things really well so that you can do what humans do really well. You can role model for them. You can talk to them about your experiences. You can talk to them about the challenges you're facing in your profession. You can talk to them about what it means to stay engaged. You can really start thinking about how do we bring education back to being that social experience where we're not teaching to our students, but we're engaging with them about our discipline, moving them towards the learning objectives. AI, frankly, can do a lot better job than I can do adapting examples and giving feedback to 45 students at once. I can't do that. AI can, but I can ask questions that get students to think. I can share examples from my experience in the discipline that AI doesn't have. I actually have worked in the field now long enough that I can say, that sounds good on the surface, but let me give you some reality. Let me bridge that textbook to reality gap for you, and let's dig into that gray area of this. AI is not going to replace us one bit. But if we embrace AI, we can actually start going back to teaching the way we want to teach, where we have dialogue and we get to talk to them and we get to engage with them. And we are not simply trying to cover the content and grade the papers, because AI can do that really, really well. So, with that said, I'm going to kind of leave us on a final reflection question for us. I want you to think about knowing that we are all teaching in the AI era. In 5 years, 10 years, what are students going to remember about your class? What are they going to remember that you did that shaped them as a student? Because the content, they can grab their phone and look it up whenever they need it. But you are still going to be a pivotal part of their educational experience. So think about, how are you making them think more deeply? How are you role modeling for them? How are you changing how they think about the field and their future profession? How are you evolving and sharing with them the challenges of you evolving in this AI era and what it means to teach? I had a conversation with one of my students the other day. She was calling me to do this learning verification, a process we use when a student used AI on their assignment, and I can't quite tell if they understood it or not. So I just require them to call me and talk to me about it so that I can grade their assignment and know that their grade reflects their actual learning. And in the call, she said, well, it just really feels like I'm being accused of cheating, even though you said I could use AI. And I said, I have to be honest with you. We are all navigating this AI thing right now. And in 5 years, 10 years, we're probably going to look back at this shift when we all adapted to AI and we're going to laugh that we were struggling so much. But I go, when you're in the heart of a paradigm shift and we don't know what the future holds and we don't know how it's going to change, we literally are just doing the best we can do to adapt and hold true to all the other constraints that are in place with us. And the student sat there for a minute and she goes, I hope to be a professor and I've never really thought about your view and what your role is. And she goes, it was really kind of eye-opening just hearing you talk about you're struggling with AI and student learning. And as I'm struggling, I'm somehow accusing you. And like, she goes, we're in this together. And I was like, yeah, we are. We are totally in this together. And I can almost guarantee that in 5 years, if somebody asked that student, what was Dr. Mandernach's impact on you? She'll go, we had this conversation once, and it made me rethink what it meant to be in this together. And so I want you to think about, what does teaching mean to you? Because the deepest part of being a teacher is about being human, and it's about connecting with them and guiding them and role modeling them. And it's all done around our disciplinary content. But I don't have to compete with AI. AI can absolutely answer questions at a level I can't. AI is there at 3 a.m. I am not, and I don't want to be. AI can adapt to their goals, their dreams, their background knowledge, their history. I can't do that for 40 students at one time. So I'm going to embrace AI, and I'm going to teach my students how to use it so it can do that. And then when they come to me, let's talk and let's think about it and let's talk about our judgment and let's talk about what this means and let's develop a relationship so later when you are struggling, you maybe don't disappear, because now you feel like there's a connection and there's somebody that actually cares if you're there and if you don't disappear. So it allows us to really go back to being human and not just being content providers and graders. So, with that said, I just want to open it up for questions, comments, ideas, sharing your own struggles or challenges right now. And we'll just kind of spend our last, it looks like we have about 9 minutes together with a little free form discussion. And I'm going to pull over the chat here and glance and see if there was anything I missed. And Jeff,
Just
feel
that
free to
I
let me
was
know if
saying,
I missed something.
mostly that I think that thinking about your own think about your own thinking is a great bumper sticker. I think
It
that's a
would
great
be.
way to put it. And thank you very much, Gene. And yes, Q&A now, respecting people's time. If you need to drop, feel free to do so. But if you can stick around for a Q&A, throw your questions there into the chat. And I just what you were talking about, Gene, I'll just reflect a little bit and say intentionally decelerating. That is something that even now in this day and age, I think about when I was in school and some of the classes that actually took that time to stop, even back then, before AI, before even, many of the things that we do have nowadays in our pockets with our cell phones and our laptops. That was still some very memorable times that I had in class. And it still, works because it is all spinning so fast.
Sure.
No question there, but in the chat. But I will actually turn it to one of the things that came up within LAD a little earlier, and that was about navigating this AI moment. And one of my colleagues asked about attribution for AI generated content, what faculty are doing on campus. Is that something that you've come across, and how they should be faculty members when they create their own materials, if they have a AI generated image or content, how they should credit that?
So most of the recommendations now just say to use an AI attribution rather than a citation. So if we go back like 3 years when this was first emerging, we had a lot of people say cite AI. Well, then everybody started arguing about whether citation was actually appropriate, because a citation implies that somebody could go back to that source and verify it. And that's not quite how AI works. And
Right.
so, and a citation implies that it was AI's intellectual property. Well, it's not quite, because without the human there doing the prompts and the human there guiding it, it wouldn't have produced it. So, what most of them are now saying is provide an AI attribution that says AI was used, and then you say which AI tools you're using in collaboration with, and then say what the person's role was. So, for example, I just was developing some content earlier. It was on AI literacy, and I was using Claude. My AI disclosure statement says something to the effect of, the author collaboratively used Claude to help brainstorm content, to generate content outlines, to write up the information, and to source content material. The author was responsible for prompting, questioning, clarification, follow up, and accuracy of all information. And so your AI disclosure kind of will give the parameters of what you used it for and then what your role was in that. Now, because we're using it so widely, generally speaking, you're not seeing that on the bottom of every single page, because it probably would be in our modern area. So if a faculty member is using it, for example, for an entire class, they might say up front in that class, whether that's on the syllabus or whether that's in an announcement, they would make that AI disclosure that would cover that entire class. Now, if it's something they're sharing outside of just their class, like maybe they made this really great image or it's a theory that they've developed in collaboration, then they might go ahead and provide an individual attribution for that. And so they would go ahead and say, this was made in collaboration with AI. Now, As you asked that question, though, just the other day I had somebody say, well, isn't that dumb that we're all making AI attributions when we use it all the time? He goes, I bet in 5 years we're not making AI attributions anymore. And I said, you might be right. But we're in the middle of the paradigm shift. And while we're in the middle of the paradigm shift, people are still uncomfortable and they still do want to know what was you, what was AI, how did you use it, what was your role, and who's ultimately responsible for this material. So I said, even if it is a paradigm shift, at the moment, the gold standard is to make an attribution.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just like you were talking about with the conversation with the student. We're all in this together.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for your time today. I don't see any other questions coming into the Q&A chat, so I'll just say look forward to our next session on the 5th of August, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.